All right, class. So for this video, it's going to be broken up into chapters, but we're going to quickly go through the major things that we learned in Computer Programming 1 that we're going to have to know to be able to move forward. Okay, so the first thing is variables. There are two types of variables. Well, actually, there's three types of variables. We have learned using the keyword let to create a variable. Now, a variable has to be inside of a scope. So if it's not inside of a scope, then it is a global variable. So this would be a global variable, okay? If I declare it, that means I'm using the let keyword outside of any code blocks. This is a code block. This is a code block. If I use the let keyword outside of any code block, then this is accessible everywhere. Okay? Now, if I define a variable, I declare it inside of a code block, then it is scoped inside of wherever that code block is. So this variable right here is scoped to be only accessible inside of the setup. Okay, if I declare a variable here, local variable, which since this is only accessible here, I could technically use the same name and it still would be a different variable. Okay, only accessible inside of the draw function. Okay, so that is how stuff is accessible using scope. So this is accessible everywhere. Sometimes we do want to have some stuff that's accessible everywhere. Sometimes we only want it to exist at a certain point, at a certain time, so that things don't get confusing. If we have all of our variables are global, especially when making games, it gets very hard to manage everything. So we want to make sure that we are staying to what we need to properly scope. Okay, now that is just declaring. There are basically two parts of using a variable. We declare, then we have to initialize it with a value. So if inside of my draw, let's just do console.log, and I'm accessing that global variable, this means I'm calling that variable, and I run this, it's undefined because there has never been a value that's been given to it. Okay. Now, with a global variable, I can assign an initial value. So I could say 25. I could run this again, and now 25 is what's showing up in my console, okay, for me to be able to access. Okay, I could put it as a string. Hello. That's what I'm going to see. I could put it as a true or false value. Okay, these are all useful things. A variable can hold multiple things. It can hold a string. It can hold a Boolean value, which is just true or false, like a switch. It's on or it's off. And it can hold any type of number. It can also hold objects, which we have played around with simple objects. Okay, a simple object is something that, let's do let simple object. We declare it globally, and then we want to set it up creating an object. Okay. This we would want to set up and initialize it with, initialize our variable with that object. So I would write the object, and then I would give it some values. So this, everything that's inside of this code block would be part of this object. Okay. Objects themselves can have attributes. Attributes would be basically a variable that only exists for the object, and we can access it using a dot operator. Okay, so let's say that I wanted the simple object to have an x value or an x position. I could say that it is at 200, and then I separate every attribute or function inside of the object, the simple object with a comma. Okay, that's our syntax. So I could do this. I could even give it a color using the color function, 255.30.240. Okay, I can create a function that's specific for the simple object, like maybe a display function. Okay, and that can have its own code block of stuff that I want it to do. I might want it to fill whatever that color with the color that I created here. But how do I reference what that color is? Well, I need to use the this keyword. When I am inside of a scope, and in this case, I'm inside of this scope right here, okay, then when I use the this, I'm going to refer to the thing that I'm talking about, which would be this. I'm referring to this simple object, okay? So I can say this dot color as the color that I want to use, okay? Now when I am creating a function, I'm always going to have to finish stuff with semicolons like I'm in my normal code. When I'm creating attributes, proper syntax is to finish with commas. If I'm missing one, I get errors, okay? So this will throw errors because it doesn't understand. So we have to make sure that we have proper syntax. And then we can create this. So maybe I might have a color and maybe I might have a shape. Maybe I want to do a circle shape at this dot x and this dot y because I want to draw at these values. Maybe I want it to have a size. So I could create that. Size, say 50. Okay, I have successfully created that object. It's a global object because I use the let outside of any code block, so it's not scoped inside anything. Which means that in my setup, which runs first, it runs exactly once, I can initialize the object with a value, which is this. I set the values of my object. It has an x, y, and a size, a color, and has a display function. Okay, notice how all of them are separated with commas? That's what we need. Now if I want to display it, oh, I got one extra. That's why I was throwing in there. All right, now if I want to display it, say in my draw, then I'm going to need to call it. Okay, calling it means I write the name. Okay, now if I just do simple object, that's not going to do anything. But the dot operator is so I can access things. So I can access parts of this object, this simple object. I could access the x, y, the size, the color, or in this case, the display. And the display is using this information to do things. So I could access that display by writing simple object dot display. Okay, now if I do this, there's my circle. Okay, now maybe I might want to have this object that's updating with, say, my mouse position. I don't want that x and y to stay there. I want it to move. Maybe I'm pushing some controls. So I can, make this a lot more complex. Maybe I want my x, this dot x, to be whatever my mouse x position is. Now this is we are creating attributes, we are creating variables, but there are also built-in variables, and we can easily find those if we go into the references. So references, we can look at events. Anything that is not inside of a parenthesis or have parentheses at the end is a built-in variable. Okay, so all of these are built-in variables. Anything that ends in a parentheses is a built-in function for us to use. That's why we like using libraries. It makes our work easier. Okay, so mouse x, that is a built-in variable. Usually built-in variables will show back as a specific color, depending on what settings you have that make things easier. So this dot y, we could say is the mouse y. Okay. Now, just because we have that, and this is throwing an error because I have to have a comma after every single attribute of a simple object, just because I have that, it's not doing anything, okay? Because this update, I want it to update what the mouse X is and assign it as that position. My display is pulling whatever that position for X and Y is for the object, which since I'm not changing it, it stays this. If you want your simple object to do things, you are going to need to call its functions. So here we call the display. If we want it to update here, we could call it, that update function. And now it's moving with my mouse. Now there are other ways that I could write this. Instead of writing it there, I could maybe inside of my display here, I could call this dot update. So I'm calling the simple object, the simple object's update function, right before I'm drawing this, and it's updating. And it's updating because my display is not happening in the setup, it is happening in the draw. The draw happens 60 times a second. Okay, so that is a way for us to be able to create an object, and we're still using variables. So variables, again, to review, can hold strings, numbers, Boolean values like true or false, and it can hold objects. Okay. The problem with this, so let me remove some of this stuff. The problem with this is what happens if we want to create many objects. This is where we want to learn how to try to reuse code. Because I have this object, I basically want to create this again. Okay, which means if I want to create another one, I'm going to basically have to copy this whole code and then paste it, which seems like that's a lot of work. Okay, now we could do this a little bit different using arrays and loops. Okay, so here's a couple ways to do it, because I could create another function or object. Let's just do that real quick. We'll create another one. I'm going to just copy and I'm going to paste it. I have a second one. And then we want to finish all of our lines with semicolons, which would be this. So now I have two objects. In my draw, if I want to display, I could do simple object2.display. This is going to start getting pretty heavy. Okay, now I see both of them. I don't really see that second one. Maybe I don't want to call the update on this one. Now I have one that stays in the middle and one that's moving around. Okay, this is tedious. There's other ways that we can do this using, so let's, instead of doing this with another object like this, let's quickly create using a loop. So let's say that I want to create this, but I want to create 5 of them, and I want them to all have random positions, maybe a random color, and I don't want them to update off the mouse X and mouse Y. Maybe I want them to wiggle. Okay, so I just want them to wiggle here after we create them. Okay, so that means that we're going to want to, since we're going to reuse code, we want to do this in a loop, and we want to create an array. Okay, loops are very, very useful. So I'm going to go to the MDM website. This is going to be basically one of your main references outside of P5.js, and we can go into the JavaScript guide and we can look at stuff. So here is where we can start kind of looking at things. So here, a loop, there's a number of different loops that we can use. All right, the main ones that we will use are for loops and for of loops. Okay, the difference is a for loop will run an exact number of times. Regardless of what you're doing inside of the code, it will run an exact number of times. So if you want something to happen 5 times, you use a for loop. Okay, a while loop and a do while loop, which we're for a lot of times we're not going to be using. A while loop is something that will happen as long as there is some type of condition that is true. So it could happen an infinite number of times. And a while loop is kind of dangerous because if you're not paying attention, you could break your code because it won't find a stopping point. A do while loop could have where it will run exactly once regardless if that condition is true or not. Okay, so you guys can read these for more details. I'm not going to be covering those. A for of loop is an easy loop for us to use because we can say that we want it to happen exactly the number of times of things that we have in our list. Okay, so if maybe we wanted to go through a list of 5 things and we wanted to display all of them, this would be a useful way to do this. Okay, it iterates through all of the objects using that can access arrays, maps, or sets. Okay, so this is super useful. We create basically a scoped variable, a local variable that's scoped inside of this for of loop that will go through each one of these, and then this is my temporary variable that I can access. So we're going to play around with those really quick. Okay, an array. So let's go and look that up. An array. There's multiple ways that we can use an array. We covered this before. An array is basically just a list of things. So when I use the square brackets, that means I create an empty array. Okay, we always have to create an empty array first. When we push, we can push things onto that array. You can push individually or you could push multiple things. Okay, we have a dot operator to access one of the attributes of this fruits array, which would be how many items. The length would give us how many items. Okay, now we can also access items of the array by accessing a specific number. Okay, so let's find a good example. Well, I'll walk through that. Okay, the main thing that we want to keep in mind is that when we count index numbers, so arrays, we're using basically index numbers. We always start at 0. In computer code, you guys are always starting at 0. So this would be not at the first position, it would be at index position 0. This is index position 1. This is index position 2. Okay? But the length will tell us how many total items there are, which there are 1, 2, 3. Okay? So we're going to use a combination of arrays to put items in the array of this simple object that we're creating. Okay? And then we're going to use a loop. Okay? So we have these simple objects. Instead of us doing that, let's just make a list. Now, usually when you are creating a variable of like arrays, you want to make sure that it ends in an S to let people know that it's a group of things. So I'm going to say simple objects. I don't need to have individual variables for this. This is kind of a way of abstraction. Okay, I can, instead of having a bunch of individual things, I'm going to have a list of things. Okay, so let's look at this. We are going to basically put this inside of something else. Okay, so we want to create an empty array. So we're going to say simple objects, and then we need to put the empty square brackets. Now we've created an array. We want to put stuff in the array. Okay, now this I could basically just say, so here's this simple object. We'll make this one a locally scoped one. Once I finish making it, okay, so I just have the code minimized. We can say simple objects dot push, and then I can push something into it. In this case, I'm pushing this object. I can do this. Simple objects dot push. Okay, now this is local. Once this goes away, once this code block ends, the setup finishes. It doesn't exist. If I run this, I get errors. Okay, if I look at my console, it's going to say there's a reference error. Okay, so but I do have. Let's look at our console.log code. Let's see what the length of our object that we just created. We have 1 because we have 1 item in it. Okay, now if I want to maybe display it, okay, I could say simple objects at position 0, I want that first item in the list, okay, that I could assign to, say, a variable. I could write it like this, maybe let's say we call it a ball. I could do this, and then I could say ball.display. Again, this is still kind of being wordy, but there it is, okay. Or we could do, instead of this, all I'm doing is saying whatever this is, I'm just attaching it to this variable and then calling the display. Another way to write it that makes it less readable is like this. I could say .display. And it's doing the same thing. Okay, now, if I had multiple objects and maybe instead of doing 0, I was iterating through, wanting to display every object, this could be useful. So we want to make some changes to this, all right? So here, inside of our setup, instead of doing it like this, let's create a loop. Create a loop to make 5. Let's call them, I don't know, balls. Okay. We want to create a loop to do that, so we could use the for loop. Okay, so let's open up this and let's look at the syntax for it. All right, we're going to go back up just so we can understand. Now, for loop, I've mentioned, runs exactly an exact number of times. Okay, there are always 3 parts to writing a for loop. We have our initial expression, which usually is some type of variable that we create that is going to have an initial value. That's what needs to go here, okay? Then we have what's happening to that variable once we hit the end of our for loop. So we hit the end of that code block, then we're going to do something to it. We're going to increase it by a certain value. We're going to decrease it by a certain value. We're then going to check this condition. If the condition is true, then we continue to do the for loop. As soon as it is false, we kick out of it. Okay, that's what makes it run a specific number of times. All right, so here, that's our initial condition. We're setting this variable I. Okay, now notice that we're using the let keyword. That is scoping it inside of this for loop. It will not exist anywhere else. Okay, we're saying I is going to start at 0. When we run through, we're going to run from the start of the code block to the end of that for loop code block. Once we get done, we're going to increase I by 1. We're then going to check if this is true. If this is true, we continue. If it's false, we're out of the loop and we're going to the line that's directly below the loop. Okay, so we're going to write that. We're going to say for, let's do let, and why don't we call it counter? Because the name doesn't really matter so much, it only exists in here. Okay, so the counter. I want to start at, how about I want to start at 1? Okay, and I want to go until counter is less than or equal to 5. And I want the counter to increase by 1 every time it runs. All right, now inside of here, what do I want to happen? I basically want to build this object. So now, let us cut this, and we're going to put it in here. Now we're going to refactor our code a little bit, because if we create them all at the exact same position, that's not really what we want. And let's say that this is going to get changed too. All right, so let's give it an initial position, and this time, let's give it a random position, anywhere from, let's say, 50 on the X to 300 on the X. Okay? And instead of 200 for a Y, let's say we want 50 on the Y and 300 on the Y. So this is ranging from this number to this number. Okay. Let's say that I want to do, so let's just take this update off for right now. This will loop through 5 times. Okay, it will give us 5 random spots. All right. And then we want to display. So this is where we want to use the array. So once we finish with this, so let me just hit this to minimize it. Okay, so once we finish this loop, we've created this object. What do we want to do? If I do this and try to push this object I'm going to get an error, okay? Because there is no simple object. The simple object is scoped inside of this code block, okay? But what I want is I want to push this object that I'm creating for each loop onto the array. So let's just move this up here. And now we're creating the object inside of a loop, okay? Now if I run this, I don't get an error anymore. Now, let's just do some quick console log code. Simple objects.length. And we see how many items are in there. Look, there's 5, okay? Now we want to display them, okay? I could do this, which is not what we want to do, but I could copy this and say, hey, that's the first one. Here's the second one. Here's the third one. Here's the fourth one. This seems redundant. This is not a good way to code. This is what you guys are doing computer programming too for. Okay, that works. I don't really like it. There's also a problem though. If I just keep going up, I have actually went outside of, because I only created 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I created an extra one. Okay, so I want to actually use the for of loop. So instead of doing this, we're going to comment out this. What we want to do is we're going to use the for of loop. So we're going to say for, and let's just call it ball of that simple objects list. Okay, what do we want to do? This ball is now going to be scoped. Okay, so we are declaring it for this scope, and we want to say what? Ball dot, we're using the dot operator, and we want to access. For every object that we created, they all have that display, so I can just do display. And now I got 5 balls. Okay, based off this. So let's do a little bit of, this is way easier code. I don't need this anymore. Okay, so now let's do a little bit more with this. When we create these objects, what do we want to happen? How about we want some random colors, okay, and maybe a random size. So let's do random, let's do from 50 to 100. Okay, how about random colors? Instead of red always being maxed out, let's say random from 0 to 255. So now we have different shades of red. How about random shades of blue? 0 to 255. There we go. Now, our update. We do want our update to happen. Now, if I am doing this, remember all of the objects are all getting run. This update would be putting it all in the mouse X, mouse Y. I want something a little bit different though. I want, instead of just taking that, I want to add to maybe a little bit. I want to add or subtract, let's say, how about -2 and 2. I want it to wiggle a little bit. I want to do the same with my Y, random. Maybe -2 to 2. And instead of this, assigning it, I need to plus equals. There we go. Now they're all wiggling. Okay. This update is getting called from the display of the object itself. Okay. I don't have access to just a simple object, but I can access it through the array. Okay, so now my code looks very, very clean. Okay, I only have one variable. That variable is holding an array of items, 5 items. Okay, I used a loop to build those 5 items. I have, so I mean, in terms of what we're looking at in code, we have something that's a lot easier to see. It's a lot easier to understand. Okay. So if you imagine that when we were doing the spaceship game, we could do this with our asteroids. We could have all of our asteroids created using loops. We could have all of our asteroids displayed using loops. And that also could mean that we're also updating all of our asteroids using loops. Okay. maybe I wanted those to reset when they get down to the bottom and they reset back at the top. Okay, we could use loops. All right, so that is using loops and arrays. I could also use the counter for this instead of writing it like this. It's the same way, but instead of me using the number 5, I would actually look at that dot length property. I actually want to make sure that I don't go up to that dot length property, and I'll be able to access everything. All right, so that's how we'd create multiple objects. What I want you guys to play around with. So let's look at making some changes to this. Okay, so let's quickly look at doing some images. How about we pick, and it doesn't matter to me what image you want. Let's say I want to do a dog image. Let's quickly walk through doing a dog. I want a dog image. Now, ideally, we probably want something that doesn't have a background. If you guys remember how to do that, go ahead and do that. Let's just download a picture. Dog. Okay, so I have my dog image. Oops, that's JFIF. I need to have something that's JPEG or PDF. So if I'm clicking there and it's giving me I need to go in deeper. So now let's look. See, that's still a JFIF. Okay, now if I go into the website itself, there's that image. Let's see if I can do that one now. Save image as. Nope. Okay, so we don't want to have the JFIF. We want to look for a JPEG. Okay, so I'm going to research again. Let's maybe dog image, JPEG. If you want to have transparency, you have to use PNG. All right, so now let's see if we can save this. Again, that's a JPEG, so there we go. Let's do that one. Dog 2. Why does it keep doing that? Dog 2. If you change the name and it's not actually a JPEG, you'll have issues. We want to make sure that we can open this up easily. Okay, there we go. It looks like it's working. All right, so now let's say that instead of these balls, instead of doing colors, I want to load an image. So I'm going to go here, hit the drop down, upload file, and I want to upload that. All right, now for loading images, that needs actually a preload function. So I can go again to the images and I can see stuff for here. Now, let's look at us doing a load image. See how it's created inside of a function. This is actually blocks code. This is stuff that we've talked about before. We want to load the image. Okay, so notice that we are creating a variable, global variable. We're giving a value. We can initialize it. We can display it. So we gave it a value. We can display it or access it in other functions. So that's what we're going to do. Make sure that we're writing proper syntax. So function preload, and I want to say, let's just call it dog image, and it's beneficial for you guys to make sure that your variables are descriptive. Okay, dog image is load image, and then we got to access the exact file name. So here I got to write case sensitive and all, dog2.jpg. Okay, now inside of my objects, let's look at that because this is what I want to do. I want to modify this. I want in my display, I only have to look at my display. I want, instead of filling the color, instead of doing a circle, let's comment that out. I want an image at, let's say dog2, dog image at this.x, this.y, and images require width and height. So I could say this.size and this.size if I just want to have it square. So there we go. There's 5 images. All right. I can also pull more specifics on how I'm pulling that image to be able to do that. Okay, so now what you guys are going to do, your guys' challenge is to create not 5, I want you guys to create 10. I want you guys to have different images. So I would like you to use another array and load 2 different images, okay? You'll have to use it in the preload and you'll have to push them. You push those 2 different images on there, okay? And then your objects, when you're creating it, I want you to randomly select what the image is going to be, and you can also use an attribute for this to randomly select between one of the 2 images. Now on your update, instead of you having it wiggle back and forth on the X and Y, I want it to wiggle on the X, but I want the Y to have it where it's constantly increasing, going off the screen, and then write a conditional, okay? A conditional, and you guys are going to have to use, you guys are going to end up having to go in here or in your references for writing a conditional, or in previous projects, okay? Write a conditional. So let's look at the references, and we type conditional. Let's type an if. There we go, if else. Let's see how they wrote it. You guys are going to write a conditional to check if the X and Y is below the screen, then I want you to reset it to the top of the screen, okay? You're going to do that in the update. So all of these are going to go from the top, so wherever they are, they're going to keep wiggling, but they're going to go down the bottom, reset to the top, okay? You are going to use a loop to build those 10 objects, randomizing between those colors, and you're going to do a loop to display those objects. All right? Good luck. Have fun.